people tend to think that grief gets smaller and better over time. I know I definitely thought that before I myself experienced deep grief, but it's actually not true. What is true is that we learn to integrate our grief moving forward, and that over time we build our life around the grief. In this video, I'll be sharing a really great model around how we can learn to integrate grief and meaning into our life so that we can live well with our grief and live a life full of meaning. Hi, I'm Christy Roberts, mindset and results coach, self-directed healing practitioner and founder of Creating Change. The Tompkins model of grief, Tonkins, the Tompkins model of grief, is a really great way of looking at grief and how over time our grief doesn't change. Like, we learn ways to integrate that grief over time because grief doesn't actually go away. So think for a moment of a well, a wishing well, a really lovely wishing well that's got, stones around the outside with the little wooden roof, and there's a bucket in the middle of this well and emotions. So the water that's in the well is your emotions. When grief hits our life, when we lose something we love that's dear to us and grief, bang, hits us, we can feel very alone in our grief. We can feel very isolated in our grief. We can literally be consumed by our grief. And so imagine that this well is in a barren, empty landscape, like life, it's just grief. Everything around you is grief. That's not a good place to be. Over time, as we learn to pull up the water in the well, our emotions, and we learn ways to feel what we need to feel, we learn ways to express ourselves, we learn ways to cope with the grief over time. Basically what we're doing is we are emptying that bucket. We are pulling the water out of the well and we are tipping it around the garden around us. We are literally tending to ourselves, we are tending to our grief, and we are watering the garden around us. Over time, that garden will grow. Over time, grass will appear, flowers will appear, some shrubs may appear. And as you go through this journey of grief and you learn to build a life around it, you learn to integrate the grief. The grief doesn't disappear, the grief is still there. So you can imagine, as time goes on, a beautiful landscaped garden with a well in the center. And the size of the well hasn't changed. The grief is still there, but around the well, you've built a life, you've built a garden, you've tended to the garden, and you've built a beautiful landscape, a beautiful life around your grief. So time doesn't heal grief. It's what we do with the time that actually does make a difference. Because if you're not tending to the garden, if you're not addressing your emotions, processing them in healthy ways, then what happens is you will end up in a barren landscape. Your grief will still be there, but the life around your grief will not flourish. It's so important to tend to your grief. So I trust that serves. That's the Tompkins model of grief. So just remember, our grief doesn't change over time, but our life grows around our grief. Thank you.